Finally, I'm very pleased to introduce our discussant today, who took on the discussion role of this seminar, Professor Kathryn Asbury from the University of York. She joined the department's Psychology and Education Research Center there as a lecturer in September 2012, after having spent a decade working on the twins' early development study at King's College in London. So her research experience is on environmental influences on pupil achievement, well-being and behavior using genetically sensitive designs. So teasing apart environmental and genetic factors for human development. And she has also commented on the role of genetics for personalized learning as a possible basis for that in policy terms. So we're really fortunate to have her here to discuss our intrapersonal approach as another possible basis for personalized learning. So I'm looking very much forward to seeing what the result is. Would this be a way forward or not? So the floor is yours. Interpersonal research, implications for policy and practice. How does the NIRE fit that agenda?
Thank you very much, Lars. I feel a bit like a primary school teacher at this stage of the day. I want to thank you for concentrating beautifully, sitting beautifully, and just 20 minutes more and you can all go and have a run around the quad. Mainly, I want to say thank you so much to the speakers and the organisers today. It's been a really interesting day, and I know that I've learned a lot, and I'm sure everybody else here has as well. I wrote some comments last week when I was preparing to come, and I've been changing them steadily as everybody has spoken today. So I'm going to rely a bit more on my notes than I usually would. But again, let's just stick with the primary school teacher thing. I'm reading you a story. Okay. So, over the last few years, in the context of my own research in behavioural genetics, I've been urging less focus on average performance in education and more on individual differences. In my view, education news and policy is far too heavily focused on means and how to affect mean level change in society. We talk too much about league tables, whether those league tables are focused on nations or whether they're focused on schools. And that kind of emphasis, which comes very strongly from our governments, leads to the kind of interventions that are solely designed to boost average performance. So the kind of thing I would be talking about in the UK is the focus on as many children as possible achieving 5 A-star to C grades at GCSE when they're 16. What that all too often leads to is extra classes for pupils on the CD border, and only for those pupils. Such interventions do precisely nothing to address individual strengths and difficulties, and also nothing to close the gap between higher and low achievers, another thing that governments claim is part of their concern and part of what they want to do. So for me, focusing on individual differences leads naturally to thinking about the challenge of personalising learning in new ways that work for both teachers and students in real schools and in real classrooms. And it's really, really hard. I don't have the answers, but what I think is very clear is that we need to work harder on developing them. And Rebecca mentioned earlier that there is at least one funder who is focused specifically on doing that, which is fantastic. So, given this kind of background, it's been absolutely wonderful to sit here today and listen to world-class researchers who are all taking this agenda a step further. So you're going beyond individual differences to try to understand the experiences that an individual pupil has over the course of a lesson, a school day, a week or a month. We've heard about some wonderful studies, and this intrapersonal approach to educational research can surely help us to understand more about what personalised education could and should look like. 3 key points seem to have emerged from this body of research, and Lars mentioned them this morning in his talk. First, when psychologists compare groups based on, say, gender or school quality, we find far greater differences within than between groups. It's almost always true. So it's very interesting, therefore, to note that the intrapersonal research reported today finds exactly the same pattern, larger differences within pupils than between them. And such findings reinforce the idea that we shouldn't be too quick to label students, something that both Lars and Andrew mentioned during their talks. Pupils' attitude to learning is not static, and this is an important message that we need to convey to teachers. Secondly, there are individual differences in how students experience the demands and expectations of any given situation. So, while for one pupil a tight deadline for an assignment could be really motivating, the same deadline could prove paralysing for another. Equally, feedback comes in here. Feedback that helps one pupil to improve could dispirit another pupil to the point whereby they quit. So the one-size-fits-all approach to education is unrealistic, and yet it's still very, very prevalent. And this is perhaps particularly true of the type of education that targets the sort of non-cognitive traits that most people today have been talking about, typically known as character education. Finally, students reported to be less task-focused by their teachers also have more ups and downs in their motivation and engagement than other pupils. They're a bit more all over the place. And acknowledging this can be helpful for teachers if they learn to recognise and capitalise on what I think Lars and Andrew both called teachable moments. I think Barbara had another word for it, but to identify these moments where students are really ready to learn. So times and situations when motivation's at its highest. And the data presented today suggests that all children and young people have teachable moments, even if some of them have more than others. I used the pictures that you actually provided for the seminar, but I have to say that when I Googled for alternative pictures, there's a really fabulous one of Lars. If you all start Googling now, you'll find someone with much longer hair from quite a long time ago, I think. So that was a highlight of my Google search. So, through their impressive diary studies, Lars and Andrew have shown clearly that this type of intensive research in schools is both doable, which is an important first step, and valuable. Lars found that pupil motivation differed more between lessons than between days, suggesting that collecting data close to the experience with very little time lag does appear to make a difference. Andrew too found higher levels of variation within a day than across days and offered practical suggestions of how to gather intrapersonal data in schools using new technologies. Both Lars and Andrew highlight the importance of recognising pupils' teachable moments. Both show that current theories of learning can be enhanced by research that gets close enough to document and to understand these teachable moments. And both raise important questions about how teachers could capitalise on them. They're really important questions, but I really don't think we have the answers yet. There's a lot more to be done here. Rebecca, while enthusiastic about big data and its potential to enhance education, raised concerns that mirror some of my own from my background in genetics. A pupil with access to data on their own achievement, potential, effort, and the relationship between those traits or aspects of their behaviour can, of course, potentially reflect on such data in a meaningful, metacognitive way and use it to enhance their study strategies and their performance. However, there is absolutely no guarantee that this is what will actually happen. It's reasonable to assume that a lot of data, an excess of data, will be helpful for some pupils, neutral for some, and harmful for some. We all know that a Fitbit sends some people in search of salad and running shoes, and it sends other people in search of wine and chocolate. Maybe that's your two types of personality, Nigel. Also, we have a tendency to measure the things that we know how to measure, which does not mean we necessarily measure the best or the most important things, or that we measure them more than superficially. As Rebecca pointed out, a focus on standardization and reliability on big data, while important and valuable, could lead to a loss of richness and potentially a loss of opportunity for young people who don't fit in the boxes that we create. In genetics, I've often made a case that genetic screening, when we get to that stage, could lead to the very early diagnosis of learning problems and to interventions that take place so early that the problem behaviour never actually manifests. It's a nice idea. I think it's potentially the most valuable contribution that behavioural genetics will be able to make to education. However, like Rebecca, I think, I'm going on your talk and also on your couple of papers, I'm aware that by relying exclusively on numbers, be they IQ scores, conscientiousness scores, prior achievement scores, or polygenic scores, which you're going to hear more and more about in the next couple of years. There's a flood of publications coming through. We are likely to miss pupils who defy those numbers and have the potential to be brilliant, or for that matter struggling, mathematicians, readers or artists, in spite of what the spreadsheet says. The numbers only really give us probabilities. They don't tell us more than that. So I love the idea that data can help us to tailor education to the benefit of every child. I really do, helping all to achieve success in life. But like Rebecca, I do worry that there might be casualties along the way. And I totally agree with the point that you made that these things haven't happened yet. They haven't hit us as hard as they're going to. So now is the time that we need to have the conversations about regulation and application and how these things can best be used to the benefit of pupils. Barbara, Nigel and Maria Christina presented their fascinating findings on creativity in the science curriculum, intra-individual approaches to personality in the workplace, and using teacher observations to enhance teachers' sensitivity to pupils' needs. Maria Christina found that struggling learners, readers in this case, showed high levels of task avoidance, but that high classroom quality increased their motivation and skills development. She pointed out the need for early intervention and individualised support for struggling readers, something I completely agree with, and showed how dialogical teaching approaches could be a useful tool in a teacher's toolkit as they try to personalise the learning experience for the pupils in their class. Barbara presented a creative and personalised approach to enhancing science engagement that was associated with increases in individual creativity and imagination, indicating that such approaches can work and should continue to be explored. And finally, Nigel discussed his very interesting plans for studying intrapersonal approaches to personality, especially maladaptive personality and deviant behaviour. And I look forward to you getting a huge grant and telling us more about it. So all of the speakers here today have taken an important step in their programmes of research, moving beyond my obsession with focusing on individual differences, not just means, to getting up close and personal with the learning process by studying intrapersonal variation. I am pleased to say that behavioural geneticists are catching up. We've just begun to take baby steps in the same direction, and the research is yielding some interesting findings that complement those presented here today. And I'll tell you a little bit about the little that I know about it. So, a little bit of background. Most of my own research has been conducted using participants from the Twins Early Development Study just up the road at King's. TEDS is headed by Robert Plomin, and we've been following the twins since they were 18 months old, and the eldest of them are now 21. In fact, some of them are on the programme that Rob and I work with at York. They've turned up as students, which is quite nice. About 10 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, I designed and ran a daily diary study in TEDS along with Dave Almeida from Penn State. And our aim was to identify the experiences at school that could explain non-shared environmental variance in academic achievement. That's what we were trying to do. For those of you who are not familiar with behavioural genetics, non-shared environmental influences are those that affect children growing up in the same family differently. So they can be things like hobbies or peer relationships or accidents, illnesses, that kind of thing. Shared environmental influences are those experiences or influences that affect children growing up in the same family in the same way. So it might be things like poverty, diet in the family, access to schools of a particular quality, parks, neighbourhood resources. So monozygotic or identical twins offer the best way that we have of getting at non-shared environment. because both genes and shared environmental influences contribute to their similarity. So any difference between them in terms of their behaviour has to be caused by non-shared environmental influence. So in this daily diary study, 60 or so pairs of 10-year-old MZ twins were interviewed every day after school for 2 weeks. And each day we asked about their experiences of particular types of stressors. So we looked at peer stressors, teacher relationship stressors, academic pressure. We also asked about flow in lessons. We used Csikszentmihalyi's flow measure, and also how satisfied pupils felt with their day. And what we were hoping was that the 3 types of stressor would explain non-shared environment in non-shared environmental variance in achievement. So we asked about them in the context of English, maths and science, and then mapped it onto their achievement in English, maths and science. But sadly they did not. We were left having not explained any more non-shared environmental variance. We did find some other interesting results, but they're not the point I'm trying to convey today, so you're going to have to take my word for it. A few years ago, a PhD student called Yao Zheng came over to London, hello Yao, from Simon Fraser University in Canada to spend some time on the TEDS project. So Yao's thing is intrapersonal variation in emotions, but he was developing an interest in genetics at the same time, so he came to TEDS to see if he could put the 2 things together. And he decided to start by going back to the diary data that we'd collected a decade or so earlier, and to look at intrapersonal variation using a genetically informed design. He wanted to know if the heritability estimates that we'd seen for emotion at the individual differences level looked similar to those for intrapersonal feelings. In the context of behavioural genetics, it was a highly novel approach to take, a highly novel ideographic approach, and it's documented in this paper that was published in Behavioural Genetics that Peter Molinar was involved in as well. Yao found substantial variability in intrapersonal feelings about school. So having done that, he went on to conduct his own daily mood study in TEDS, the initial results of which came out earlier this month in Psychological Science. So in this second study, Yao used the short form of the PANAS to look at day-to-day variability in positive and negative affect over the course of more than a month. So the twins, who were 17 at the time he collected his data, were asked to provide PANAS data after school every day for 40 days. So only data from twins who gave data on at least 30 of those 40 days was included. And this added up to 447 twins and more than 15,000 data points. The study did only have 1 data collection per day, so it's lagging behind the studies that have been presented here today in that respect, but it does represent real progress in our field in this direction. So, what did Yao find? I was going to give you a slide with what he actually found, and then I thought I was going to get in a muddle explaining it, so I didn't. But actually it's not very muddling. So average negative affect was 53% heritable, which is pretty much what we would expect it to be. What that means is that 53% of the differences between participants in their negative affect were explained by differences in their genes. There was no significant effect of genes on positive affect, and 42% of the variance was explained by shared environmental influences. That's quite unusual. By 17, shared environment doesn't explain very much variance in anything, so it's quite notable. But what the findings support is Ed Diener's 2-factor theory, that positive affect is more situational and negative affect more dispositional. And this seems quite important and suggests that school-based interventions as shared environmental influences, which is how they're often conceived, could be effective if targeted at the promotion of positive affect rather than the remediation of negative affect, which seems quite important in the context of the debates that are certainly happening in the UK at the moment around mental health and well-being. I don't know if they're being discussed to the same extent or seen as such a problem in other places. But the interesting bit for you is that when Yao looked at fluctuation across the month, so intrapersonal emotional variability, he found that both positive and negative affect were significantly heritable. So the heritability estimate was 54% for fluctuations in negative affect and 34% for fluctuations in positive affect. So, one possible explanation of the heritability of fluctuating feelings involves the norm of reaction. So the idea that individuals with different genotypes have different ranges within which their behaviour responds to their experiences, responds to the environment. Intrapersonal variability of affect can therefore be understood as an indicator of individual ability or responsiveness to the environment, in this case school. This explanation demonstrates the dynamic nature of genes in shaping individual behaviour in the face of daily experience and the important role of gene-environment interplay. The findings also fit really nicely with the differential susceptibility hypothesis that's been put forward by Jay Belsky and Marinus van IJzendoorn, the orchids versus dandelions hypothesis. For those of you who haven't come across it, it's a very interesting theory, and it's the theory that suggests that some individuals are more susceptible to the environment than others because of differences in their genotype. And there's been some really nice work done on early reading using this hypothesis, done by Adriana Buss at Leiden and also van IJzendoorn. So Yao's now taking a further step in a study that I'm collaborating on with him in exploring genetic and environmental influences on emotion inertia and emotion regulation over time. So watch this space. It's still one time point per day, so we've got a little way to go, but there's a definite interest in the field in getting involved with the kind of research that you're doing. I don't know if I've got all the parliaments covered, but I hope so. So before finishing, I just want to say a few words about policy. So given that we're a long way from, Rob, you look really confused. Which parliament do you need help with? Oh, sorry, no, I didn't include you. You're one of us now. Given that we're still quite a long way from knowing how to make personalisation work in practice on any kind of a large scale, and from being able to present evidence that particular personalisation interventions really do work, technology was the great hope and still has to be, but the evidence isn't there yet. It might seem too early to engage with policymakers about what we've learned so far. Intrapersonal research, like behavioural genetic research, is at a stage where we know we've learned something important and that it can't not be relevant to education, and how we can enhance it, but we don't know exactly what to do with it yet. And this can make us reluctant to engage with policymakers, perhaps too reluctant. It seems to me that one impact we can make on policymakers is that we can present evidence that helps them to understand when they are wasting their time and our money. The sort of research presented here today can combine with behavioural genetic research and other bodies of psychological and educational research to make clear the deficiencies in focusing on mean performance rather than individual differences, and on implementing one-size-fits-all approaches. We can show, for example, that you can't say you want to close the gap and yet continue to focus on average performance, as it's likely to have the opposite effect. We can show that pupils change over months and years, but even over the course of a day, and that they're subject to different influences at different times in the school day. And this really should trigger a discussion about labelling and fixed expectations, and this can feed into teacher training. We don't have to have all the answers. It's reasonable to go to government with our findings, and instead of presenting a perfect, neat discussion slide, just say, this is what we know. You're the policy people. What do you think it means? Policymakers might have useful ideas based on their own experience, and the opening of a two-way discussion is valuable. We don't have to go in and lecture and say, this is what you need to do. We don't even have to know. We just have to share what we've learned. It's also useful to remember that policy is capricious and heavily based on personal relationships. There's a strong element of luck, we'll call it non-shared environment, in whether you have the opportunity to present your research to someone who's interested and gets it, And this will make a difference to whether there is any kind of a meaningful response and whether your research leaves any kind of a mark. I've been in discussion with the head of strategic and policy research at the Department for Education about the implications of behavioural genetic research for a year or so now. And there is no doubt in my mind that this relationship only developed and persists because that particular individual has a degree in genetics and happens to be interested. Tomorrow I'll go to the Department for Education to speak to a different team about what we know so far about the heritability of non-cognitive traits and what that might mean for character education. So we'll be talking about things like grit, mindset, motivation, self-control. As always, we will say that our evidence suggests a need to focus on individual differences, not just means, but it's perfectly possible that this team will not be interested, that the research is too basic, too far from a clear application, or simply too far from Justine Greening, our current Secretary of State for Education, from her personal interest. Character education was the previous incumbent, Nicky Morgan's hobby horse, and we don't know if it will translate to the new person. The important thing to remember is that politicians and policymakers change, like a lot. And given the importance of personal relationships in this area, if one contact doesn't work out, if you've got something meaningful to say, talk to somebody else. Don't lose heart. The more researchers do this, the more we can raise awareness that at the very least we should be promoting the development and testing of new evidence-based personalisation approaches. And that's it. Thank you for listening, and thank you for all of today's speakers. I've really enjoyed it. It's been a really great day.